Party Congress. And during the meeting, a historical resolution was announced. And this is only the third time a historical resolution was issued during the party's 100 years existence. I mean, we don't know exactly the text of the resolution, but according to the communique that was published after the meeting, it elevates Xi Jinping to a status in the party's history that only rivaled by the founding father of the party, Mao Zedong, and it will very much signals that Xi Jinping will have the third term as China's president and potentially become, the president for life for China. And this, if any of you read the text of the communique, it's all the symphony of, Xi Jinping as the great leader that is leading China into a new era. I mean, as an outsider who watched this, from a human rights perspective, this is actually, quite scary. I mean, I'm sure that many of you are aware of the general human rights situation in China, Xinjiang. I mean, people are detained in the camps, and the rest of who are not in the camps are under severe surveillance. I mean, in Hong Kong, just yesterday, a man was sentenced to 5 years and 9 months in prison for shouting slogans calling for Hong Kong independence. Let this sink in. It's in Hong Kong. I'm sure many of you lived in Hong Kong or reported in Hong Kong that a man is going to jail for 6 years for shouting something on the street. And in the mainland China, not right now it's the COVID situation. Today I just had lunch with a activist just left China. I was asking, can you actually do some activism that is not on the radar? And he was telling me this is not possible because every move of yours is monitored. So, he said, I have no information I can tell you that is not online because we're just not doing anything. So May just mentioned in 2008, we already were advocating that Beijing should not be given the opportunity to host the Summer Olympics because the human rights violation is bad. But looking back, that is actually a golden age of the opening and reform China. And many have protested, including Human Rights Watch, that earlier before the Winter Game was awarded to Beijing, that Beijing shouldn't get a second chance. However, this is going to happen. And, and the International Olympic Committee is not only not considering having the game to be hosted somewhere else, it's actually being completely silent on China's human rights violations. Maybe Minky can talk more on that.
Yeah, we can talk. What I'd like to do is direct this conversation to the issue. There's more than one actor here, right? There's the CCP, there's the Chinese people, but there's also the global audience, and there's also the corporate sponsors who are putting lots and lots of money into these games. Who are they, and what are their obligations and roles with regards to this current climate and the worsening human rights situation in China? Minky? I think you're on mute. I can't hear you.
Thanks very much. So just a quick clarification about who the audience is. So the Olympics, generally speaking, have an audited audience of about half of the world's population, 3.4 billion people. A lot of people will be watching these games, and that always attracts a group of sponsors called the so-called Top Sponsors Program, and that's TOP, stands for the Olympic Sponsor Program. It was established by the International Olympic Committee in 1985. It's the top level of sponsorship for the Olympic Games, and each company invests around $100 million to associate with the 5 rings. But as Yachao was saying, this is a very different year to be associating with the Olympic host. And as Human Rights Watch has said, crimes against humanity are happening in China. This is quite unprecedented. It wasn't the case in 2008. And these companies are in a unique position to use leverage. And when we talk about these companies, let me just say who they are. They're Intel, Omega, Panasonic, Samsung, P&G, Toyota, Visa, Airbnb, Atos, Bridgestone, Coca-Cola, Allianz, and Alibaba. And many of these Olympic sponsors have policies. They've adopted the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and they have their own policies committing them to work in a human rights frameworks that also obliges them to disclose how they identify and address human rights risks. So when we talk about the different players on the field, as it were, for the Beijing Winter Olympics that launch on February 4, about less than 3 months from now, we have fans, we have athletes, we have the International Olympic Committee, and we also have these top sponsors.
Okay, so what have the top sponsors said about this and the worsening human rights situation in China?
So Human Rights Watch wrote to the 13 so-called top sponsors in May. We asked for a response by June. We have one response back in writing. Other sponsors have said that they're engaging on human rights in their own way. And Human Rights Watch has encouraged, as said, basically the time for quiet diplomacy is over, and that it's time for the top sponsors to urge the International Olympic Committee to adopt human rights. It's time for them to disclose their own supply chains in China, particularly any products that have the 5 rings of the Olympics. And it's also time for the sponsors to speak out about the worsening climate for human rights and press freedom, and how this is going to negatively affect the games that they are literally paying for.
So there was a U.S. congressional hearing in July where sponsors basically try to say that they both support the Olympics and they support human rights. Can they do both at the same time at these games, Sophie?
Well, certainly not without publishing robust human rights due diligence strategies that show that they have asked, all of the necessary questions, that they've affirmatively embraced this obligation, to look at all of the different aspects of their sponsorship and what it means, and actually put in place mitigation strategies if they identify risks to support redress. But a lot of them seem much more interested in trying desperately not to have this conversation. There's a reason that we wrote to them months ago to try to catalyze a constructive conversation about what a rights supporting approach to sponsorship could look like, which would include saying, we're extremely concerned about forced labor, or we're not able to do the kind of due diligence, or, we don't manufacture products, or textiles, we manufacture chips, for example. We don't see problems in the supply chain, but it's raised these issues in other aspects of our operations, and we need to interrogate those. But those conversations just didn't happen, really, until a number of companies did agree to appear before the Congressional Executive Commission on China. But I think those who watched it will have found the answers that the companies gave to members of Congress lacking. There were a lot of twisted hypotheticals, even, when they were asked directly if they would sponsor games that were being hosted in another country that was committing serious human rights crimes. If, there were a couple of hypotheticals tossed out, they really all just ducked it. And this comes at a moment, May, as you well know, when there are deepening concerns about forced labor in supply chains, that's serious enough to be moving governments to consider legislation, either in response specifically to Xinjiang or to China, or more broadly. And our view is really that a rights-based approach to business requires this kind of human rights due diligence, and that's not what the companies are actually doing.
I'm going to play the devil's advocate here for the moment and sort of pretend I'm like a business person and corporation. And their point of view would probably be something along the lines of, we are here to maximize shareholder value. We are here to make dollars and cents. And if we take a position on this, we are going to alienate China. We're going to alienate the lucrative Chinese market. We are going to maybe jeopardize our supply chains. We cannot do any of this. There have been companies that have done so and clearly suffered putatively. We are just going to try and keep a low profile and duck out and stay neutral and not go one way or the other. Can they do that? Basically speaking, with this games, particularly with all that's going on?
I think for a long time, companies have built into their business models that nobody was really going to get too far into these questions, or that they were going to be, clearly ethically expected by way of a document like the UN's guiding principles to do this kind of due diligence, or to be obliged by way of legislation, which is what's going to happen soon in the European Union, to follow through on these things. On some level, I think there are a lot of shareholders who would probably be pretty unhappy, and indeed we've seen this happen over the last year, are extremely unhappy to find that their money or that public pension funds are growing on the backs of forced labor or repression in Orwellian surveillance technology firms. It's too hard to try to divide. It's not possible, really, I think, to divide those things anymore.
Well, that brings me to one question from one of the members of press in the audience, and I will take a point at to interject at anyone who wants to. Please put your questions in the chat function, also identifying which press organization you're from. This one's from Christoph Becker at FAZ, and the question specifically relates to the forced labor issue. Is there any positive proof that forced labor is used in the supply chain in the games? Who wants to take that one? Sophie, Minky? Mm-hmm.
Sophie first.
Sure. Okay. I would look at the list of suppliers and companies that can be found on the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region, of which Human Rights Watch is a part. The supply chains are complicated. And one of the challenges that investigators have in assessing these things is unsnarling the supply chains. So we have not identified any particular risks to products in the supply chain, but, and this is an important but, it is our view that any product, any good, any services that is coming from Xinjiang has to be considered problematic, because human rights due diligence in that region is impossible because of the extent of political repression. And really there's an affirmative obligation on the companies to show that their supply chains are free of forced labor. It's not that the world has to wait until we find it. It's that the obligation is on the companies to prove that their supply chains aren't tainted.
If I could add to that, I think it's important that we also tell our audience what standards we're using. I mentioned the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights before, and that is widely adopted by all but one of the top sponsors. The one top sponsor that has not adopted the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and does not have a human rights policy is Alibaba. The other companies have adopted the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And what it says is it says respect and protect. That's the shorthand, but there are also 4 pillars. And the first is human rights due diligence, as Sophie mentioned. The second is remediation. If you find child labor in your supply chain, you're obliged to fix it and to remediate it, make it right, put the children back in school, but also compensate them. The third pillar is the second pillar is monitoring. The third pillar is remediation. And the final pillar is transparency. And I would say that one big gap here is transparency. So we're publishing today the letters that we sent to the top sponsors. We're also publishing a statement about it. And what these letters say is we ask sponsors to make clear what steps they've taken to ensure that their supply chains do not have forced labor. And we've also asked them to take a responsibility to address the negative human rights impacts that are directly linked to their operations, products, or services. And all of these things are, the great thing about the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is it's a framework. It assumes human rights problems will happen, but it gives you a framework to deal with it and then to be transparent about what bad thing happened and what you did. The biggest gap that we see is that there is next to no transparency about business operations in China right now.
Well, speaking of transparency, isn't there some updates on the top sponsor list that aren't particularly reflected right now that you'd maybe like to tell some of our press corps that may not know about this?
Well, in the course of contacting companies, we found out to our surprise that actually two of the long-standing so-called top sponsors for many years, Dow and also GE, General Electric, both of them have been sponsors, I think, actually dating back to the last Beijing Olympics. We certainly were in touch with them about the Sochi Olympics as well in Russia. And both of these companies stepped away from this relationship at the end of the Japan Olympics, the Tokyo Games. So, however, the International Olympic Committee has not yet updated their top sponsor page. And so we want journalists to avoid any confusion about who is and who isn't a top sponsor.
Okay, great. Which brings us to the role of the IOC here. So the companies are sort of saying our hands are tied. We just want to do business. We want to keep down. But the IOC itself is even more specific on this, right? They're basically saying, we should not politicize sports. We don't want to, we're not getting into this fray. What are their roles and obligations into this whole business? Vinky?
Yeah, I'll take this one and then hand over to Sophie. So broadly speaking, the Human Rights Watch has been urging the IOC to adopt human rights since before the Beijing Olympics, and more specifically to adopt the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights and to put human rights in the Olympic Charter. Currently, human rights is not in the Olympic Charter, and this is very surprising to many people because athletes are humans and they have rights. And everyone in the ecosystem of the Olympic movement, which means workers producing T-shirts and backpacks and Olympic mascots with the 5 rings, all have basic human rights. The IOC has published a human rights strategy, but it has not yet adopted it. And we think it's very problematic that the IOC is waiting until after the Beijing Olympics, which were awarded in 2015, to adopt human rights. If there was a framework for dealing with human rights abuses going into an Olympics associated with crimes against humanity, it would obviously be much better. So the strong call from, I think, 160 plus human rights groups around the world is for the IOC to adopt human rights and actually start speaking out about the very terrible abuses that are happening in China, but also the abuses that may be tied to the operations of the IOC itself, including press freedom, labor rights, and any products associated with forced labor.
I see a question here from Tenzin from Radio Free Asia about recent protesters that have targeted China's human rights record, disrupting the torchlighting ceremony in Greece. And do these news reach the sponsors? Are there hopes that sponsors will have a change of mind when the Games is just a few months away?
It's a great question, Tenzin. I don't know how anybody could have missed that story since it was reported widely all over the world, and presumably at least these companies' compliance officers keep an eye out for stories like that. But it doesn't seem to have prompted much of, certainly not a change in public position. I think it says a great deal, though, about the IOC's willingness to try to hide or keep aspects of the Games out of sight, especially parts of it that have been the focus of protest in the past, given that the torch was promptly put on a plane and flown to Beijing. They seem to have skipped the torch run exercise this time around, and I gather is only going to be run between the different venues inside, in Beijing and some of the other areas. So there won't be an opportunity to have protests along the way. And I think that in and of itself is a pretty powerful statement of the difference between 2008 and 2022.
Okay, there's another question here from Tracy Holmes from Australian Press, which was, before 2008, we were having these conversations about Tibet. And now it's about Xinjiang. Has the spotlight over many years made any difference to the way the IOC award games and conducts its business? Minky, you want to take that one? You seem to have gone mute. Could you unmute?
Sorry about that. So I think before 2008, I think the spotlight was on a full range of human rights abuses in China. It's been really hard for human rights activists to keep up with the abuses. And I think you've got parallel crises around Tibet and Xinjiang. And you also have just unimaginably harsh repression of Hong Kong, plus Chinese human rights defenders and others who are serving long jail sentences. So I think for people who follow China, the overarching lesson is that the government has used the cover of COVID to escalate markedly reprisals against critics around, both in China and outside China. And Tracy, since you're, as a journalist, the other big area that I would flag that May did at the beginning is that we have, one answer to your question is no journalists are going to Tibet, right? The Foreign Correspondents Club of China in March of this year released a really important report, which was called Track, Trace, and Expel. And that's all you need to know about the Chinese government's approach on press freedom. And I think your question is right. The conversations aren't happening because there's not a lot of reporting coming out of China. It makes those conversations very hard. And that means the Chinese government has taken all of the wrong lessons of 2008.
Okay, the next few questions are specifically on the sponsor issues. Both the Wall Street Journal and Reuters want to know whether GE or Dow gave you any specific reasons as to why they stepped away from being top sponsors, and was it in any way related to human rights? And following up on that, Gabby from Telegraph would also like to know if any of these companies responded and how, and what the next steps are. Minky, you want to take that?
I'll take that. And then I think Sophie had an add-on to Tracy's question.
Go ahead.
First question is, we had one written response from Allianz, which didn't answer the very specific questions. And I might have Sophie speak to that. The Dow and GE did not say why they had stepped away. I think that's really a question for them, and a good one. The other sponsors, and I think it's important to say that a lot of them do have robust human rights programs. We've worked with them over the years on things like LGBT rights in Japan ahead of the Tokyo Olympics. But the really salient takeaway here is that companies do not feel able to speak out or to respond even to a question about their human rights due diligence in China. Sophie?
I guess I would just rephrase that slightly, which is to say that, companies are banking on their consumers and shareholders not pushing them to do what they should and what they might be expected to do by way of legislation in other jurisdictions. They just think they don't have to answer these questions. And it's unfortunate because we have seen instances where some of them have played a more positive role. And I think they are really giving away some important leverage by failing to do what they should around the Beijing Games. But just to go back to Tracy's question for a second, I mean, Tracy, if you had asked us in 2008 whether we thought that the central government's and the regional authorities' policies towards Uyghurs would devolve to, or maybe rise to, depending on which legal way you want to think about it, the level of crimes against humanity, we probably would have said no, or I certainly don't think we would have predicted, the establishment of mass arbitrary detention facilities of this scope and scale. But I also think we probably wouldn't have predicted at least some of the kind of discussion we're seeing amongst governments using terms like crimes against humanity and actually pushing for investigations, as would be the standard approach, or is the standard approach to, similar human rights crises in other countries. And I think that's an interesting change too. And, one of our overarching goals is to see the Chinese government officials who are credibly alleged to be responsible for crimes against humanity targeting Uyghurs actually investigated and prosecuted. That's what international law says. That's what international institutions are supposed to do. And they're supposed to do it regardless of how powerful the state in question is. And that's a live discussion is I think, a real change. It'll be a historical change when we actually see people like Chen Chuanguo being indicted. So we've got a ways to go, but it's a different conversation internationally now.
One more question from Christoph Becker from FAZ. What do we hope to see from IOC sponsors between now and the opening of the games? Would anyone like to take that one?
So the statement that Human Rights Watch will release at the end of this press conference has very specific, narrow, and actually highly achievable calls to sponsors of the games. And the call is also long overdue. I mentioned before obviously the Beijing Olympics. There were very serious human rights abuses at the Sochi Olympics in Russia, at the Brazil Olympics, and on the horizon you also have France in 2024, Los Angeles in 2028. And Human Rights Watch is going to be reporting on abuses for the host countries of all of these Olympics. So we've got a call to sponsors to actually collectively or individually convince the IOC or press the IOC to adopt the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And these are that bedrock UN standard that all enterprises and companies are supposed to uphold. And this is not a high bar. Using a sports pun, this is a low bar, right? This is the lowest common denominator. It's what's required, and it's a framework for dealing with abuses like we are seeing now in China.
Let's go back to the IOC for a minute. They've said they can't do anything. Sports is sports. It's not politics. But if we look back historically, that's not really true, is it? Would you like to be able to recall some of these instances where sports and politics mixed in very specifically at the Olympics?
Yeah, and it's a good question. But first on China, for an autocracy like China, the Olympics are very much not just about sport. That's why the government's been so determined to host the Olympics actually since the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. The Olympics are a geopolitical event that can help leaders elevate their status at home and abroad, and it gives them credibility on the international stage. I think the real danger for sponsors, governments, and everyone else is that the Chinese government could interpret the hosting of the Olympics as a ratification of the repression that Sophie and Yachao have referred to. The world does not need a ratification of crimes against humanity, repression in Hong Kong and Tibet, and crushing of human rights defenders in China. So in past, there are many histories replete with past examples of when the International Olympic Committee, usually under pressure, has actually taken an important political stance. And for example, when apartheid era South Africa was sending all white teams to the Olympics, they were banned for a period of years. Taliban-run Afghanistan was banned from sport, both for not letting women participate and for executing people in stadiums. So when the level of the human rights abuses reaches a very high scale, as we've documented in China, that's a moment for the IOC to step in and use the power that it manifestly has.
Okay, one more, Gabby, I don't know that if we fully answered Gabby from Telegraph's question, which is to know if any of these companies responded and what way, specifically. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that, Minky?
Yes, so a written letter from Allianz, some background meetings to share our concerns about the failure of the IOC to adopt human rights principles and to entrench it in the Olympic system and charter. And then finally, I think the sponsors are increasingly under pressure, in part because the IOC has not spoken out on human rights, other than to say things like the latest is to say that the Olympics in China will be a celebration of humanity. And all of the evidence is very much to the contrary. So I think that's also, I might pitch it back to Yachao to say to you, as you know, is this going to be a celebration of humanity?
Okay. I'd like to put an interjection here at this point. Okay, Sui from New York Times is asking, what else are we, Human Rights Watch, all planning to do to pressure the companies as we head into the games? Sophie, you want to take this one?
Sure. I mean, we're certainly going to be following up to try to get responses, since really Allianz is the only one that's replied in any way on paper or electronically. I think there will be, Sueli, you won't be surprised to know that we're going to look at what we can to see if we're able to find any indications of real problems for any of those individual companies. But I think we also have a lot of work to do getting out and educating some of the other actors who might be able to help move those companies, and whether that's athletes, who are sponsored by these companies, whether it's their shareholders, whether it's, financial outlets or financial media outlets who are interested in what some of these conversations haven't been like. We're going to try to move some of these actors, because I think, there are companies that are increasingly nervous about their exposure. To things like forced labor, especially as legislation and, growing, I think, awareness of consumers, rises, that people don't want to be wearing clothes made by forced labor. People don't want to be buying products that might be risky in that way. And so part of the reason that we chose to focus on the sponsors and why we started this dialogue with them relatively early on was to be able to try to take this forward in the next couple of months to show what the sponsors haven't answered, right? And what they are obliged to do, and what kinds of risks that really creates for the companies, and why it may not even make business sense, as May was suggesting earlier, to just duck the questions. Sorry, May.
Sorry, question from Eunice Yoon from CNBC. Hi, Eunice. What's your, this is the boycott question, which is, what's your sense of the appetite for a boycott among officials, players, or companies? And what do you think we'll see realistically?
Well, I think the players, it's a terrible situation for the players. They don't really get a choice. They can either give up their opportunity to compete at all, or, say they don't want to compete in environments like these. And I think one of the trends that will be interesting to watch in coming years as we live in this era of athletic activism is whether players are going to start getting much more assertive and asking for and insisting on a role in choosing where they wind up competing, because this is not, a happy reality for them. Sorry, Minky, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to
say back in too.
Yeah, I wanted to also just kick in that Sophie referenced the athlete activist, and I think athletes shouldn't have to fight for their rights, especially when they're being sent into a situation where we're a human rights free zone. And I think I might actually ask Jia what some of the risks that athletes face are. But certainly the lack of privacy. If you have political opinions, it's going to be difficult for you to express them. In 2006, the speed skater Joey Cheek used a news conference after he won a gold medal in speed skating to call attention to genocide in Darfur. And we've already seen athletes speaking out to Stephen Jung's question from CNN. We've seen athletes who are speaking out about human rights concerns, and I think it is absolutely the case. We will see more as the countdown to the February 4 opening ceremonies happens. But it also has to be said, athletes shouldn't have to take these risks. And I think the downhill skier Michaela Schifrin said it best, which is, why should we have to choose as athletes between our morals and our jobs, right? Or our sport? And I think that's a very important question. And for many athletes, this is their job as well. So I think it will be a very interesting area to watch, the development of athletes' rights, but bear in mind that they are under a lot of pressure not to speak out, and that's also not right.
Yacho, you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I'm sure that reporters who joined this call are aware of the press, the freedom of speech situation in China. Many of you, from different outlets have been kicked out, and some of you have, fled. This is a very fortunate situation. I mean, even for, we all know the two Michaels from Canada. They were there for no reason. They got detained because some bigger geopolitical situation that has, they have nothing to do with it. So, I mean, the situation is very precarious for anybody who goes to China, especially if you speak against the government. And there have been new laws on, if you say, defame the national heroes, you can be sentenced to 3 years. And of course, there are myriad of ways they can punish you for speaking up.
Sophie?
Can I just jump back in, because I'm not sure we answered all of Eunice's questions. The issue about an official boycott, by which I assume you mean whether countries will unilaterally boycott the games. I don't think we're expecting to see, the US withdraw the whole team, or Australia or any government do that. There has been a lot of discussion about the possibility of a diplomatic boycott, meaning not sending senior officials, as would normally be the case, to games, with a view towards denying the Chinese government and the party the kind of political legitimacy it wants out of hosting. There have been two interesting twists in the last couple of weeks. One is that the new COVID-related restrictions that the Beijing Organizing Committee and the IOC announced a couple of weeks ago could be read to mean that senior level diplomats and officials aren't invited anyway. We've gone to lots of governments and asked them how they've interpreted these new restrictions. But then just today, I believe it was reported that Xi intends to invite President Biden to come to the games. So I think this is still a live issue for governments who are trying to figure out what they're comfortable doing. We've had some interesting conversations about what they should do instead. And we've said, look, you're perfectly capable of celebrating National Olympic athletes as they leave to go off to the games and to come back, and doing that in your home countries. But you also shouldn't pass up an opportunity to equally applaud activists from across China for their Olympian efforts to promote the rule of law and free speech in a clean environment. And we've suggested that governments find ways around the opening of the games to celebrate those people as well, as a way of sending a message about, from our perspective, that would be a real celebration of humanity, not what the IOC means by that term.
Okay. Question here from Stephen Lee Myers from New York Times. Given the scale of rights abuses in China, is there anything a sponsor can do, short of withdrawing sponsorship, that would have a meaningful impact in China?
Yeah. I'm happy to start with that, but we actually want the sponsors to engage on human rights. We want them to, follow the steps that we've mapped out for them about getting the pressuring the IOC to adopt human rights, which all these sponsors have mostly already done. And we want them to actually work on the very serious problem of human rights and crimes against humanity in China. I think it's a corporate decision they have to make. I would say that in the past, for example, McDonald's withdrew from its sponsorship of FIFA and the World Cup in Qatar, possibly over preventable migrant worker deaths, or not, but we don't know because they didn't say. But any sponsor who does pull out should actually go ahead and say, this is because we don't want to be associated with crimes against humanity. We took this, we decided to invest in the Olympics because we wanted to support human dignity, human achievement, and that's the opposite of what's happening in China right now.
Okay, I think this concludes our, our conference on this, a press conference on this. I want to thank all the panelists for taking time, and I also want to thank all members of the press who took part in this and participated for your very thoughtful questions. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone, for participating.
you.